Conditional reasoning is one of the most powerful tools in your LSAT arsenal, and it's more important than ever now that LSAT is increasing its prevalence on the LSAT logical reasoning section. They can no longer test these concepts in logic games since there is no longer any logic games section. The good news is if you can master conditional reasoning, you can unlock answers more quickly, more accurately, and gain the edge that you need on LSAT test day. Today, I'm going to break down for you how to master LSAT conditional reasoning. First off, for those who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I've been teaching the LSAT since 2005, and I personally increased my own LSAT score from a 152 to a 175. Now, today I'm going to break down for you conditional reasoning step by step. Let's start with the basics. What is conditional reasoning? It's a type of logical relationship that connects two different ideas where if one happens, the other must follow or might follow. Think of it like a chain reaction. If A happens, then B follows. For example, if you get a scholarship, then you must have applied. Here, getting a scholarship depends on applying. This introduces two key concepts: sufficient conditions and necessary conditions. A sufficient condition is like the trigger. It's enough, all by itself, to guarantee the necessary condition. In that example, getting a scholarship is the sufficient condition because it initiates the chain of events. In contrast, a necessary condition is what must be true if the sufficient condition occurs. In this case, applying is the necessary condition. You're not going to get a scholarship without it. Think of it like the requirement or prerequisite that has to be in place. Here's an easy way to visualize it. Imagine the sufficient condition as the key that unlocks the door. The necessary condition is the lock itself. Without the lock, the key won't work. Together, they form a complete system, a coherent whole. Now that we've covered how this basic relationship works, let's talk about how to identify these conditions in actual LSAT questions. The LSAT, of course, is full of indicator words that signal conditional relationships. For sufficient conditions, you want to look for words like if, when, whenever, all, any, each, and every. These words introduce the trigger, the thing that is sufficient to guarantee the next step. For necessary conditions, keep an eye out for words like then, only if, must, required, and depends on. These words all point to the requirement, the thing that must be true for the conditional relationship to hold. You've got to memorize these indicator words. They're your road signs for navigating conditional reasoning. Now, one of the biggest traps or biggest challenges with conditional reasoning are reversals and negations. Reversals happen when you flip the conditions without negating them. And a negation happens when you negate both conditions, but you keep them in the same order. LSAC loves to exploit these kinds of mistakes, and so it's critical that you recognize a reversal and a negation versus a contrapositive. Now, the contrapositive is where you flip and negate both the sufficient and the necessary conditions and is logically equivalent to the original. So, for example, if you are a successful entrepreneur, then you innovate. If that was our original statement, again, if you are a successful entrepreneur, then you innovate. A contrapositive would be where we switch the order of these conditions and we negate both of them. The contrapositive in this case would be if you don't innovate, then you are not a successful entrepreneur. The original and the contrapositive mean the exact same thing. Recognizing equivalent statements that are equivalent in their logic can help you analyze arguments more efficiently and avoid common traps. In contrast, if we were to reverse these statements without negating them also, we would end up with a statement that is not logically equivalent to the original. For example, a reversal of this statement would be, if someone innovates, then they must be a successful entrepreneur. That's not true based on the original because innovating doesn't guarantee entrepreneurial success. And for the same reason, a negation would also not be logically equivalent to the original. So a negation of this statement would be, if someone is not a successful entrepreneur, then they don't innovate. Again, this is not true because they might innovate in other ways. Now, mastering conditional reasoning isn't just about understanding the concepts. You've also got to practice them until they become second nature. So first off, memorize the indicator words for sufficient conditions and necessary conditions that I mentioned earlier. Overall, the LSAT is not really a test of memorization. It is much more a test of pattern recognition. But if you are not able to identify conditions, you're not going to be able to do conditional reasoning, of course. So this is the one area where I would recommend flashcards if you feel you need it. The next step, of course, is to practice identifying the relationships in actual LSAT questions. Look for the trigger, meaning the sufficient condition, and look for the requirement, meaning the necessary condition, wherever they may come up. In some cases, you may want to diagram conditional relationships. Overall, I'm not big on diagramming in LSAT logical reasoning, but for conditional specifically, it may sometimes be helpful. When you're diagramming, you may want to map out symbolically the sufficient condition with an arrow, followed by the necessary condition after it. So the simplest example would be X arrow Y. X requires Y. If you have X, then you are guaranteed to have Y as well. Now, this raises the question, in which question types are you likely to consider diagramming? It's going to be specifically in cases where you have formal logic, meaning you have multiple conditional statements written in a very tight way. You're not going to see this in strengthen questions or weaken questions or necessary assumption questions, but you may see it in inference questions like must be true. You may see it in sufficient assumption questions, and you may see it in parallel reasoning questions as well, but you're not likely to see it in the vast majority of types of logical reasoning questions. Now, when you are approaching one of these formal logic questions that involve conditional reasoning, you want to focus on valid inferences. You want to train yourself to recognize what you can conclude and what you cannot conclude from a conditional statement. Stick with what the logic guarantees and don't overextend beyond the scope of what is covered in that stimulus, meaning you don't want to engage in a negation or a reversal, for example. And when you do make mistakes, which is going to happen from time to time, it's okay. Go back, analyze where you went wrong. Did you miss a key indicator word? Did you fall for a reversal or a negation? Understanding your errors, reviewing in depth is key to making improvements. This is why at LSAT Unplugged, we walk you through the review process using the Socratic review method to help you pinpoint exactly where you're going wrong. Is it in the stimulus? Is it in question stem recognition? Or is it in the answer choices? You've got to figure out exactly where you're going wrong so that you can avoid making the same mistake again. This is what we coach you through in our group programs, in our one-on-one programs. If you're interested in finding out more, you can check out the links below to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to support you. Now, when you are approaching any logical reasoning question, you've got to make sure that you stick with only what the question tells you in that stimulus. Don't bring in outside information. Don't bring in real world assumptions beyond the scope of what is covered. While you might think if someone innovates, they must be creative, to reference back to that example I mentioned earlier, that could be a reasonable real world assumption, but you can't assume it on the LSAT unless the test explicitly states it. You've got to treat every statement they give you as evidence, as fact, no matter how strange or unrealistic it might seem. Now, conditional reasoning is a foundational LSAT skill. You will see it across different question types, like inference, like sufficient assumption, like parallel, which is why categorizing questions by question stem type doesn't always capture the full story of what you need to work on. That's why analytics platforms are limited in their usefulness, and you need to do a deeper review of your mistakes when you're looking to review, and that's why one-on-one coaching can be so effective. If you master conditional reasoning, you're not just going to improve in one area, you're setting yourself up for success across a large percentage of the logical reasoning section. And again, this type of reasoning is increasing in importance over time going forward. Now, again, if you'd like my help on your journey to scoring a 170 or above, my team and I would be glad to support you. Check out the links below. And in the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.